Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. And we're here today with special guest, Mark Vernon, who's here to share with us his new book, Awake, William Blake and the Power of the Imagination. How can William Blake's vision of imagination help us see life in a new way today? Well, today's guest is here to share with us just that. Mark Vernon is a writer, psychotherapist, and former Anglican priest. He contributes to programs on the radio, writes and reviews for newspapers and magazines, gives talks, and frequently podcasts. His books cover themes including friendship and God, William Blake and Dante, ancient Greek philosophy, and well-being. He has a PhD in ancient Greek philosophy and other degrees in physics and theology. So welcome to the show, Mark Vernon.
Thank you very much for inviting me on. It's a delight to talk about these things.
Oh my goodness, what a great honor it is to have you here and to talk about your new book. So what first drew you to William Blake as a focus of this work?
I live in South London, and William Blake, with his wife Catherine and collaborator Catherine, lived in South London as well. They worked on the poetry, the imagery, the prophecy, as I think William Blake offers us. And so, in a way, he's my local mystic, and walking the streets that, even he would have walked. It made me want to know more about this figure that a lot of people have heard of. People know phrases like "to see a world in a grain of sand." They maybe know his poem "Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright." They kind of come across that at some point. But he said, "I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall." And I wanted to take him at his word. What does that really mean? Where can that really take us?
Oh my goodness, there's so much to unpack there. But I think the probably place I really want to start for folks that maybe aren't as familiar with William Blake. Can you share a little bit about his history with us?
Yeah, so he's a figure of the Georgian period. So this is when George III particularly was on the throne of England. It's the period of both the American War of Independence and the French Revolution. So the end of the 19th, into the 19th century. And he lives therefore in sort of very turbulent times. There's much up in the air. And he develops a particular artistic style in order to try and engage with all that's unfolding in that turbulence, both in terms of events, but also I think he's right about this, that there's a sense in which our minds and our imagination are becoming more modern at that point. Lots of ideas that we have about freedom, about reason, about the imagination, about spirituality, our relationship to the natural world and to the divine world. They're very much taking a shape that's familiar to us now about then. And so through his poetry, engaging with great thinkers, and being troubled often by his times, he sought to put together a kind of creative analysis, but also antidote, which is why I think he can still speak to us today.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us and how remarkable it must be to be in South London where he has walked. And it seems like such a magical journey he's been on, and you as well.
Yeah, I mean, London changed hugely in his times. It was the British Empire reaching, into the Indian subcontinent, at the start of Blake's life in the 13 colonies, and then the colonies of the islands as well. It was a burgeoning um, mercantile city. It quadrupled in size during Blake's lifetime, and the part that I live in, Camberwell, Blake actually refers to as the lovely hills of Camberwell, which are now kind of rolling suburbs. So there's also a sense, I think, of whilst the modern world brings very many tremendous good things, I think there's a sense in which we can get lost amidst all that material gain, all the what things that make life, good and comfortable and entertaining. But is there a sense in which we lose something with that as well? And so, Blake, who comes at this time of change, I think he can help us reconnect with the things of the interior life, you might say, which because our material exterior lives are so full now, we can become uncoupled from.
Yes, there's so much there that we kind of get attached to, which is a whole nother topic, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right.
How would you describe Blake's understanding of imagination to someone who's encountering him for the first time?
Imagination is really central to Blake, and I think what he pushes back from is the idea that, I don't know, say, you have imagination, I might have some of it too, but it's our kind of private possession, as if the creative person has a bit more of it than someone with a more prosaic soul, say. And Blake says, no, that's not right. It's more like a great flow of the imagination that shapes all the things around us, the living world. It has us. And the question is, how do we align to that? How can we collaborate with that more? And I think that's often what, the artist would tell you, that it wasn't solely their creation, but they were collaborating, almost receiving inspiration. And inspiration means to be breathed into. So the novelist will tell you that once it was up and running, the characters kind of worked themselves, or once they got into the image, it started to show up almost of its own accord, needing everything that the artist has, but somehow bigger than the artists themselves, which is why, great works of art become universal. Well, Blake says that dynamic, it's available to us all actually, and it's always already shaping us. And so we live in a fully enchanted, fully alive, dynamic world. And that's one of the things which people can start to doubt in the 200 years since his death. And he would say, no, if you really think about and examine the way that the imagination works and how it comes to us, it gives us vitality. Then you can reconnect back to that wiser vitality, and so find meaning and purpose again.
And so, to dovetail with this part of the discussion, in what ways do you think Blake's ideas challenge common assumptions about creativity?
I think that he was clear that creativity is not about sort of projecting out onto an otherwise dead cosmos the color, the beauty, the awe, the wonder, which I think is more or less a common assumption now, that most things are mechanical. They may be very sort of elaborate and sophisticated, but kind of working through inner forces and effects and so on. Blake says, no, it's not by some miracle that we human beings, somewhere from with our own skulls, our own bodies, can create a sense of vitality and beauty that we then sort of throw out onto the world. No, we're receiving all that creativity and beauty because we're part of it. And we're maybe the creature that maybe more than others is able to reflect on that dynamism. But I don't know. The snake warming itself in the sun, the bird singing in the tree, the bird too winging it on the air. Blake says, how do you know? But every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight closed by the senses five. So he would have us reopen what our modern philosophy tells us, to realize that that immense world of delight is there for us to share and discover, not sort of try to struggle to create of our own volition.
It seems that our world collectively is in such chaos. What does Blake teach us about sustaining innocence in the face of suffering?
Yeah, innocence is a really important quality for him. So thanks for picking up on that. And by innocence, he doesn't mean naivety, although often you see innocence, in the child, which can be naive at that stage. But the other element of that is a kind of openness, a vulnerability, a capacity to say yes. The curious child wants to know everything, and when they are naive, that can cause them trouble, of course. But there's a kind of innocence which is wise as well. Blake says innocence doesn't dwell with ignorance, but with wisdom. And that is able to stay open to the heart of things. In principle, at least, although this is way easier said than done, regardless of what happens, regardless of the chaos, regardless of the suffering. When you meet someone who is bearing a huge amount and yet still wants their life, still seems able to say yes to life. That's very inspiring. And that is the kind of innocence that Blake feels we need to hold on to in a world that is full of darkness and full of horror. Because if you lose that capacity to say yes to life, then you really do start to enter the kind of vicious spiral. Nihilism was a word that was coined in Blake's lifetime, and that coinage, I think, is a kind of warning. But Blake offers an antidote to that, and this kind of wise innocence, this ability to be open and to keep saying yes, to affirm what's good and beautiful and true, in spite of what's even very bleak indeed. He feels that the human soul at root does that, and then we become more and more human as we do so.
So, based on Blake's approach to innocence and experience, is that revealing how people can grow through hardship?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. That innocence and experience, if innocence is the kind of aboriginal openness and experiences what happens when that life happens, then actually, they're not so far apart, because even in the midst of difficult experience, love is often present. The reason why we care about horrors that are going on is because the care is actually stronger than the horror. What would be really bleak was as if, no one even minded anymore. There really was a kind of indifference. And so even when things are hard, the acknowledgement that things are hard is good news still, because it suggests that there's something that is still kind of assessing and realizing that the darkness is present, and that must come from the light, I think.
So, what role does spirituality play in Blake's vision of art and human experience?
Yeah, the spiritual is really important. To cut to the chase, he feels that at the heart of actually all things, but we human beings can know it consciously in particular, is a divine presence. He talked of the human form divine, and by that he means both a kind of mystery that's at the heart of us, a wellspring, a source, that gives rise to all that we experience in life. But he also means that there's something which is utterly reliable at the heart of us as well. That even in the most difficult times, people will find that there's a resource there that maybe they didn't even know was there, except for the difficulty. And so that divine presence is known immanently, as the theologians would put it, within us. But that immanence is also kind of more than us. And so we're held in a kind of divine embrace. That would be a key element of his spirituality.
Is there a quote from Blake that talks about his spirituality that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, there's one which came to my mind when I was thinking about what we might say, and it goes like this. It says, "There's a moment in each day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. But the industrious find this moment, And when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day, if rightly placed. So there's a moment in each day that Satan cannot find. And by Satan, Blake means a kind of closed, narrow, possessive approach to life. But that closes off, you might say, the pregnant moment, the moment of meaning, the moment of transformation, which is in every day. And in fact, when we learn to live from that presence, that moment can renovate every moment of the day when it's rightly placed in our imagination. So this is about a kind of shift of perspective, a formation that doesn't treat life as just a relentless succession of instants, going somewhere, sometimes going, we're not quite sure where at other times, but instead coming to the present moment and realizing that in the present moment is always a possibility or a potential for change, for something different, if we can perceive it aright and perceive it with this kind of openness, this receptivity. Yeah, so there's a moment in each day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. But the industrious find this moment and it multiply. And when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day, if rightly placed.
It's so easy to see why he was such an inspiration for this book and just the work, the way that you explain it seems very poetic and evergreen, regardless what generation we're in.
Well, the poetic element really matters because I think what the poetic phrase can do is not just tell you that something exists, but give you a feel for the energy of that existence as well. And when you connect with that energy, that's when you're in the present moment. And by paying attention to the energy as much as what's actually being said. That's how a poem works. And that, I think, is how a living spirituality works as well. Blake says things like to see a world in a grain of sand, as I mentioned at the start. And that full quote goes, to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity for an hour. Now, those kind of phrases, you kind of half know immediately what's meant. You want to know more of what's meant, but it's somehow by paying attention to the energy in those very phrases, those poetic phrases, that over time you can be led to know that more and more. Another quatrain that I hold close to my heart and I feel keeps opening up to me from William Blake is this. He says, he who binds to himself a joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. And that kissing the joy as it flies and living in eternity's sunrise, again, I have some sense of what that means, but it's the energy and the phrase that promises that I can know more and more of what it might be to kiss the joy as it flies and live in eternity's sunrise.
Such a great quatrain to really focus on throughout the day and really unravel for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, these phrases came to me, when I was actually in quite a difficult place myself. I work as a psychotherapist, and that involves your own therapy. It's very much a formative kind of training, and that's difficult. In a way, the whole point is that you know about your own difficulties, so that others that you then work with can have a sense that difficulties can be present and it's not the end of the world. And they only really get that if they sense that you know that as well. So there's this formation in my training was very hard, and um, but it was discovering phrases like that that provide not just a consolation, but almost a kind of orientation. I wanted to try and look in that kind of direction, and so not forget the difficulties, but discover something that was stronger than the difficulties, more reliable, and then you're able to live more innocently in this full sense of being able to say yes to things.
So, how does Blake's idea of angels and visions expand our understanding of perception?
Yeah, another great question. I mean, it's one of the things which I wanted to stay open to in engaging with Blake, writing the book, because many people that write about Blake now, they're rather inclined to diagnose what he said and others said of him, which was that he lived with angels and other spiritual entities. I think every day, actually, that these presences were quite alive to him. And so the temptation is to say that he had some sort of condition. I mean, some of them that do the rounds are so-called hyperphantasia, which is a kind of excess of inner imagery. And then others will say, no, it was aphantasia, a lack of inner imagery. And that's why he became an artist, to try and bring up that imagery. And then others will say it was some sort of temporal lobe epilepsy. That's often one that's referred to when it comes to spiritual visions. And I mean, I've even heard it say that Blake had some sort of migraines that fractured reality, like the zigzag lines, when people have migraines. But I think Blake was a very discerning man. He had a great critical faculty for himself, and he wouldn't be fooled. I mean, great creatives that write poetry that lasts centuries, they're not fooling themselves, because otherwise we feel that in the work and it's not interesting to us. It's when there's something penetrating and insightful in the work that we want to keep reading it, and that comes from the poet themselves, and certainly in the case of Blake. And so I wanted to say, look, maybe rather than diagnosing him and keeping me safe in my own worldview, how can I stay open to these living intelligences that are beings around us and within us? And I don't see them in the way that Blake said that he could, but there's feeling, there's mood, there's perceptions in other ways too. And perhaps that can be part of this reconnection to the dynamism of the wider world as well. I mean, another way of putting it is that in my work as a psychotherapist, I've worked with people that do see things that are kind of troubling to them and also are trapping. And I think that's a really important difference, that if someone sees something and it kind of confines them in a narrow world, then that is perhaps suggesting that that is something coming from their own minds. But when there's a relationship, when there's an openness, and people are kind of led out of themselves with what they know, what they see, their engagement with these wider dynamics in life, that to me suggests that there's more that's being invited here. And so it's that direction of travel that I think Blake can help us with when he describes conversing with angels and other beings. I mean, the other element is that I've, in previous work, looked at figures like Plato, and Plato's great hero is the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates. And again, it's very well tested that Socrates lived with an angelic figure that would inform in his work as well. And Socrates is one of the great founding figures of Western civilization. So working out how to take these things seriously again, I think, is a really important part of our times.
No, I would agree with you. And I just love the fact that you have this book that's written that people can really connect with William Blake on a very personal level and develop that relationship with his work.
Yeah, I mean, one of the parallels I draw is our own personal development, and how that is about really being able to appreciate things more and more subtly. The very young child, you have to speak to them in very straightforward and literal ways. And if you try and say something too fancy to them, they get confused and maybe even upset. But then, as your child grows, you realize it gets more subtle about things. I mean, even the development of a sense of itself, so it starts saying, I would like this rather than Jim would like this. Moving to the first person rather than the third person. This kind of development is something we all go through, and so eventually, we're able to read poetry and appreciate it. We're able to read and engage with subtler stories and get the inner meaning. And so, in a way, I think Blake's is saying, just continue that development. Don't feel it stops at about the age of 13 or something, when you've kind of developed the capacity to appreciate all that you can. It carries on throughout our life. And even in the second half of life, maybe then it can even get more sophisticated, because after the kind of midlife where maybe less interested in establishing who we might be ourselves and get more interested again in the wider world. And that can be an ongoing process of personal development.
What do you think Blake means when he portrays energy as eternal delight?
Yeah, energy is a really key word for Blake, and it's linked to eternal delight. It's partly this vitality, this vivacity, this joy, but also this capacity to keep going sometimes, but to make something of what's happening to us in life, discover something that is being shown to us in life in that making as well. And but energy for Blake, he doesn't just mean it in the modern sense that a physicist might. Energy in physics is actually defined as that which can do work. So it's like a potency or a potential, a kind of power. But Blake feels that energy is eternal delight because actually it's always drawing us back to the eternal. It's always forming us in a way, if we pay attention to it aright and collaborate with it aright, that leads us back to the light. So energy is eternal delight. It has a kind of purposefulness within it. It's not just amorphous energy that could go one way or the other. Um, it's a bit like, when the sun rises or watching the sun set, we get drawn to that, not just because it's beautiful, but it is, but somehow it seems to speak to us of something that is just over the horizon of our perception. And so the energetics, even of the sunrise, has this quality of there's a direction of travel there, which is why a sunrise or a sunset is a timeless image. It's saying more to us than just a kind of formless beauty. This beauty comes from somewhere. It can take us somewhere. It can reveal something to us. So energy is eternal delight. Has that kind of um, that momentum in it for Blake.
So, how does Blake's engagement with Christianity, alongside influences from other traditions, shape his vision of the divine?
Yeah, he is Christian, but he's Christian in a porous sense, by which I think he would say that Christianity was the way that a perennial truth that could be known in other traditions came to him. I mean, he's very devoted to the figure of Jesus, for example. I mean, it can be quite surprising to readers of Blake how much the figure of Jesus matters to him. But for him, Jesus is the figure who helped him and helps those who follow the Christian tradition realize that, say, that the mortal and the immortal, or the human and the divine, or the finite and the infinite, or the temporal and the eternal, like we were just saying, they meet in we human beings. The Christian idea of the incarnation, that Jesus was the God man, not because, as it were, the human was pushed out in favor of the divine, or conversely, that the divine was pushed out in favor of the human, but the human to its fullest extent is divine. That's what Christianity teaches about the figure of Jesus. And Blake was aware of that. He lived into that. But I think he also saw parallels, particularly in Indian traditions, actually, because in this period of the British Empire, the deep involvement with the British Empire in the Indian subcontinent. There was a lot of extraction going on there, but of course there was also the bringing of ideas from India to London, where Blake lived in particular. And he's, for example, an early reader of the Bhagavad Gita, which is first translated into English in the 1780s. And I think he saw in that story of Arjuna's struggle and then Krishna's revelation, a meeting of the human and the divine as well. And it was very invigorating for him to see that in this other tradition and find the energy of that same kind of meeting in his own tradition in Christianity. And so I personally value a Christianity like that. I would call myself Christian, but with this sense that that's just my first language, if you like. in these spiritual matters, and it's a joy to feel the parallels and the differences, because sometimes differences are important because they can be expansive. They can take you into new areas by challenging you. But yeah, that open quality of spirituality, I feel and see in Blake, and he gives voice to it in the poetry too.
How would you interpret Blake's statement that if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear as it is infinite?
Yeah, so this is another one of Blake's pretty well-known phrases, and the expression "the doors of perception," or even just the Doors, the rock group, the Doors, got their name from Blake. And then there's a famous book by Aldous Huxley about ecstatic experiences called "The Doors of Perception." So it's a phrase that has entered the popular imagination, but Blake, I think, didn't want us to think the doors of perception are cleansed so that we see things infinite just through exceptional or ecstatic or kind of manic peak experiences. I mean, that can happen. But then there's always the problem of how you integrate that with everyday life, so you don't become addicted to the next peak experience or the next trip. And I think really what Blake's talking about with that expression is something a bit deeper, which is that there's this philosophy that does the round that tells us that our perception of things, through our sight, through our hearing, through our touch, and so on, is like a barrier that separates us from the wider world. I mean, so we can be mistaken in what we see, and then the emphasis in modern psychology is very much on the mistakenness, to the point that some psychologists would tell you, our sight is always deluded in some way. And Blake wants to push back against that sense that perception has become a kind of doorway with the door shut, and instead wants to cleanse the doors of perception, by which he means refresh the psychology, refresh the philosophy itself, and stress instead that what we see, what we hear, is much more like a portal or a threshold through which we receive in finite ways. We see certain things, we hear certain things, but in those very things can be heard echoes of the infinite. So it's like a stepping out through our perceptions rather than a closing off by the more modern idea of what it is to perceive. So Blake, he saw this modern idea coming. I mean, it's very standard now in neuroscience, for example, to say, for example, that our consciousness is somehow generated by our brains. And Blake would be, I think, if he was around now, would be one of the smaller group that would say, no, our brains and our bodies, our minds, they shape, they resonate, and they collaborate with a wider consciousness. And that is the doors of perception cleansed so that we start to see things as they are, infinite.
You approach this work in such a unique way with your experience as a psychotherapist and former priest. How do you feel that this has shaped your perception of William Blake?
The thing that, in a way, draws all this together is a deep interest in inner life. And, the psychotherapist works with people on the ways that their inner life is trapping them or causing them to suffer in some way. But what Blake adds is inner life is not just your inner life and my inner life as if they're separate things, but our personal inner life is actually a fraction, a reflection of the inner life that fills all things. There's an inner life that's, as it were, out there, except it's not really out there somewhere else. It is part of our inner life as well. And I actually think that modern psychology needs to recover that sense that this inner dynamic is not just something that individuals have, but that it can be reconnected with, and that's going to be a crucial part of healing. I mean, again, to sort of make it a bit more explicit, you might be advised by, well, a friend or maybe a psychologist that going for a walk can be good for you, and that would be because it gets you outside. It's a bit of exercise. It has certain physiological effects on you that can be a relief. But I think that a walk is also a good thing, because getting outside gives you exposure to wider energies, a wider interiority than just your own. Our houses often become reflections of our own interiority. And the minute we step outside of our homes, therefore, we're in contact with a wider interiority. And it's that connection that brings relief because it's expansive. It's saying you can be yourself, but step into more than just yourself. Very much like stepping outside your house is to step into a world that's wider than just your private world. And so I feel this kind of inner interiority that's everywhere, not just our own. It has actually enormous implications for the way that psychology and the way that people are helped. And maybe the loss of that wider interiority is part of the reason why it seems that trouble psychologically in one way or another seems to be growing in our world.
So, what does Blake's idea of contraries offer for people navigating inner or outer conflicts right now?
I think this is really such a good insight that he has because um, one of the things that it's so tempting to do in a fragmented world, and this happens in families, let alone in societies, is to kind of opt for one side over and against the other. There's the bad mum and the good dad, or the good aunt and the bad uncle in families. Or then conversely in society, there's the good side and the bad side, and things become very tribal and divided. And Blake says there's something else that's going on here that can get missed, which is that actually all of life is held between what he calls contraries, like you're saying there. And the image actually comes from a bit of science that was growing in Blake's time, which is the science of magnetism. And you'll know that a magnet has a north pole and a south pole. And those two poles, whilst being opposed, are also completely connected. If you chop a bar magnet in half, thinking I'll take the North Pole and separate it from the South Pole, instantly you just have two magnets with two North Poles and two South Poles, as it were the contraries are always there. And so Blake's saying that actually these contraries, they might matter because like the North and South poles of a magnet that hold the field of the magnetic energy, so too the contras in life can be understood as actually connected, even though there's difference there, because that connection and difference combination creates the tension that is the energy of life itself. And so, very practically within yourself, in your immediate circle, in wider society, it can be very invigorating to turn to the contrary that you feel opposed to, because it's an art, you have to kind of get it right. But that can help you discover something that otherwise would be lost to you because you just stayed on the side where you feel comfortable, that you feel is the good side, that's the easy side. There's a temptation to do that, and sometimes we need to do that to refresh and to recover. But by turning to that which is more difficult, that which feels opposed, it's possible to find a kind of truth there. There's someone who seems like purely the bad guy. Actually, they've got something to say. And that if you can work out how to relate to that, the field of your own energy expands, it grows, you become a bigger person. I mean, as I'm saying this, I'm sort of sitting up and my chest is opening. I'm taking slightly deeper breaths. That is the value of being able to embrace the contraries that otherwise we're inclined to sort of try and cut up and divide in life. But I think you've also, though, got to have a kind of faith that it's worth doing that. And I think this links back to what we were saying earlier, that if you see life as fragmented, just belonging to otherwise isolated individuals, then the temptation is to try and cut up the contraries and divide and split and so on. But if you trust that life actually is shared by us all, that there's a wider dynamism, a wider flow, then the challenge becomes to ask yourself, so how does what seems contrary to me fit within that wider picture? What is it tapping into? What can it teach or show me? And so a kind of sense of something which transcends us all and can embrace differences is really important and part of Blake's vision. And I hope that the kind of applications to today are kind of obvious, really.
So, we started this conversation briefly talking about materialism. So, how do you see Blake's criticism or critique of materialism speak into our current social and cultural climate?
Yeah, so materialism for Blake, it means sort of materialism in the two senses of the word. I mean, one is the hope that by having more and more material things, we'll find happiness. And then the other sense is the more philosophical idea that at base, everything is material, is atoms in some sort of complex assembly. And he thinks the two are related, actually, that if you feel that at base everything is just matter, then it kind of makes sense to want more and more of that matter to build up your life, in goods, in material stuff. And Blake argues that that's a mistake because we're spiritual beings and energy is eternal delight. And unless we can train our desires to want to share in that wider vitality, we're going to be frustrated no matter how many, material things that we have. But he also says that the way to go about that, though, is not to be sort of prudish about it or moralizing about it or trying to curtail our desire, because as we were just saying with the contraries, even the desire to want more and more things, there's a truth in that, which is, as Blake puts it, more and more is the cry of a mistaken soul, but nonetheless, nothing less than the all will satisfy us. And we human beings have this sense and taste for the infinite. And so what modern materialism is doing is confusing us, because it's saying that that sense and taste for the infinite can be satisfied by accumulation, whereas Blake says no, it needs to be satisfied by participation in the wider whole. And of course, that comes about not through possessiveness, but by giving and by offering all that we have to those around us, to the world around us. That brings us contact with this more, with this all. And so you get this paradox, which is very common in wisdom traditions, that it's in giving that we receive, as the figure of Jesus puts it. That makes sense when you live in this world of abundance, where by giving away, you actually grow your contact with more and more, rather than the assumption, which is common now, that things are scarce and so we must possess and hold on to them and secure them. And that actually closes life down. So that's the sort of quite complex but powerful sense of the material and materialism that Blake wants to challenge. He doesn't want to just reject it, because at the heart of it is this desire that's right. We do want more, but we need to realize that we get contact with the all, even not by possessing things, but by actually giving of ourselves to others and to the world around us. And then all that they have becomes available to us, and the abundance of life starts to show up.
What do you think Blake teaches us about living with openness and depth?
I think there's a kind of, again, a slightly fancy philosophical word, but you might say there's a kind of decentering that Blake encourages. It's in that those earlier lines that we were enjoying. He who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy, but he who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. And in those lines, you can almost feel, I think, a kind of movement away from the center of myself being somewhere inside myself to a center that I share in something else or someone else, kissing the joy as it flies. I can participate in that dynamism by discovering that my openness and depth is present in other things as well. It's not just an interior possession, but can be found not just elsewhere, although it feels perhaps like elsewhere at first, but then we realize that that elsewhere is part of what we share too. And so there's that opening up that comes with depth. Again, depth can be used to refer to something that's kind of private and cut off, as if the deepest parts of myself are known only by myself. But Blake says, actually, whilst it can feel like that as a first step, what you realize if you continue on that trajectory is this decentering. That actually the depths that I know inside myself are the depths that are in all things, all people, all places. And again, we know this. If you, I don't know, go to a holy place, you feel the depth of the place resonating with the depth inside you. And so you make that connection. Or if you know a wise person that has depth, it's not just that the depth is in them, but it kind of stirs the depth in you. The psalmist says, deep calls unto deep. And so that's the kind of openness and depth that Blake can help us tune into more.
In what ways do you see Blake offering a path towards renewal and hope?
I think that what he says is that renewal and hope doesn't come by rejecting things, by feeling that things have gone terribly wrong. And with that, the cultivation of a kind of negative energy of perpetual criticism, perpetual despair, the kind of doomsterism that can become so powerful today. Blake says no, that hope actually comes by realizing that even in what seem like dark things, there's truth, there's light. We were talking about angels earlier on, and in the mythology, the demons even are fallen angels, which is to say that they once were drawn to the light, but turned from that light into themselves, feeling perhaps they could possess the light themselves. But that's to say that even the demons, there's a residue even of wanting the light in them. And so I feel that Blake offers hope because it's precisely by trying to bring things back together again rather than cutting them up and fragmenting them, by following our intuitions and even the intuitions of those who we feel are deeply wrong, that actually will find connection again if we can find the ways of bridging across what otherwise seem like divides, because the bridge is actually our common humanity, is something that, whilst people take it in very, very different directions, at the heart of it, we share, a desire for more, a desire for an expansive humanity, a desire for pleasure and delight. Um, we can all make terrible mistakes in pursuing those things, but at heart, Blake says they're true. And so it's by discerning them better rather than by coming sort of moralizing, for example, that we'll actually find hope and renewal.
How do you hope readers and our listeners will use Blake's vision of imagination in their own lives?
I mean, I very much hope in my book that Blake's poetry feels like it becomes a friend. His imagery feels like you want to live with it. I mean, I come across, say, a Blake image that somehow attracts me. I don't quite know why, but then I get a printout of it or a postcard of it and I put it on my wall and I live with it. And it's in the living with it that you feel its energy. It opens up to you more and more. And so I hope that people can feel there's maybe a Blake phrase that they want to live with, but then there's another one that they're not quite so sure about, but they kind of feel it's got something. And then by reading around, my book and others, gradually that opens up to them. And so, Blake becomes one of these figures who becomes a friend for life. You can read even the same phrase, going back one more time to he who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. You can go back to that phrase again and again and again, and it's almost like every time it reveals a little bit more to you. I mean, this is what inspired texts are like. Some texts are sort of officially inspired, like the Bible, but I think Blake writes inspired texts as well because the text itself or the image itself is kind of on a threshold. It's a sort of portal that can transmit more and more to you. Yeah, so I Blake has changed my life, and I wanted to write the book partly to continue that process of engagement myself, but also to invite others to turn to Blake, to lean on Blake, to befriend Blake, in our times.
Well, Mark, I felt your book was such an impactful read. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work?
Look, thanks for talking. It's wonderful to talk because it's in the effort to find the words, that between us, something I hope is made present, and Blake becoming a bit more present too as well. But I have a website. It's markvernon.com. I use social media and YouTube, Substack. So those are the kind of places. If you Google Mark Vernon, something should come up.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thanks for inviting me and for all you do, sharing these things with people.
Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Mary Ann, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Mary Ann is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Mary Ann will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmaryann.com for more information.